I don't do what I do because I'm interested in clicks. I don't do what I do because it's a job and it's better than, working construction. It's my calling.
Right.
This is my mission. Not by that I don't mean necessarily doing interviews or doing podcasts, like ideas have consequences, but engaging the world, defending the faith is my calling. And the way that spills over into issues of truth.
Much of the world today is enthralled by the philosophy of globalist elites. Entities bent on ushering in a new world order in pursuit of an androgynous, egalitarian utopia. Cloaked in the language of sustainability, equality, and social justice, they labor to dismantle national sovereignty, private property, enterprise, masculinity, family, and every other good gift ordained by God. A trillion-dollar ecosystem of international organizations, from the United Nations to the World Economic Forum, thrives on propaganda designed to stir moral panic. The media acts as their megaphone, weaponizing fear to enforce compliance with globalist decrees. These institutions have openly championed population control, the regulation of energy in the name of climate, and the genocide of children in the womb. Their so-called green policies strangle wealth creation while enriching bureaucratic elites. Though they parade as agents of peace and prosperity, they are architects of a culture of death. Their philosophical lodestar is cultural Marxism. Their political destination, a globalized communism. This project is a direct assault on free markets and decentralized governance through the global redistribution of wealth. The poor are made to carry the weight of political theater, masquerading as virtue. The stated goal is to uplift the impoverished. The true aim is to undermine the wealthy, suffocate enterprise, and punish success through confiscatory taxation and regulatory stranglehold. Globalism is also the vehicle that has driven the scourge of foreign aid, sowing dependence, enabling corruption, and binding nations to perpetual servitude. As those who believe in true freedom and human flourishing, we must resist globalism and expose it wherever it rears its head. My guest today has built a reputation on precisely this sort of confrontation. He has fearlessly exposed the lies of the World Economic Forum, USAID, and their ilk. For this, he has been harassed, even visited by SWAT police this year as his enemies sought to silence him. Larry Taunton is an award-winning author, columnist, and producer. He has debated prominent atheists and Muslims on CNN, Al Jazeera, and on stage. He has organized and chaired symposia on science and religion at Oxford, Princeton, and the Edinburgh Literary Festival. And he hosted the now famous God Delusion debate, which continues to echo across the globe. He is now the host of his podcast called Ideas Have Consequences. Larry has lived a life of courage and danger for the sake of truth and for the honor of Jesus Christ. He and his wife Lori are the parents of 4 grown children. I am delighted to welcome him to Flames and Crowns. Larry Taunton, thank you so much for joining me on Flames and Crowns. I have been looking forward to this conversation for a very long time and for multiple reasons. One just being, I love how you have tackled what I consider to be very important topics that not many people are courageous enough to actually deal with. But I think the other thing is a lot of the things that you talk about and that we're going to get into today are the kinds of things that I have seen the consequences of firsthand. Things like globalism, things like WEF and UN policy, USAID. And I've seen the destructive things that have come about because of these initiatives and institutions. And I think you've done such an astute and incisive job over the years in trying to really shed light on the devastation that these institutions cause. And so I've really been looking forward to this for a long time. And I feel so privileged and honored that you'd avail your time and your wisdom to me. So thank you for being here.
Pleasure to be with you, Lennox.
Yeah, of course. Well, a good place to start is just trying to get some background in terms of what prompted you to deal with these subjects. What is it about globalism that caught your interest? What is it about the WEF, for example, that caught your interest that you thought needed a deep, incisive work? Where did this all begin for you?
Well, that's a tough question to answer. I've always had a great deal of interest in these kinds of issues, but my interests are actually, and this I think will please you. My interests are actually theologically driven. That is to say, I was trained academically in a very secular environment, a history, philosophy. I was always interested in the interface of the academic world with the real world, and also how my faith interacts with both of those, because it has always been a feeling of mine that Christians have a tendency, evangelicals and otherwise, have a tendency to become fairly, monastic, not in the strict Catholic sense, but I mean withdrawing into the family life center, as I like to say, and keeping the world out. And I want to give Christians, fellow believers, I want to give them a confidence to engage the world, and where that starts is helping them understand, what's actually, taking place. So that really is what motivates me. And as it relates to specific things like globalism or USAID or the World Economic Forum or those kinds of things, a couple of decades ago, the organization that I founded and that I direct, Fixed Point Foundation, our interest was taking a muscular Christianity into the world. And so there's a reason we didn't call it Jesus Ministries. We called it Fixed Point Foundation because I was interested in using my academic background to go into secular environments. So, I mean, in the strict sense, you could say that I'm a Christian apologist, but I think I'm fairly, out of the mainstream, more like who I think is your boss, Doug Wilson, in this regard, because I want to, I don't even want to be on the Christian, speaker circuit, where I'm just throwing red meat to people who agree with me, and where that's called apologetics. Very few of the so-called, well-known apologists, it seemed to me, actually do any real apologetics, like taking on people of a different worldview. And I thought, no, I want to go into the arena. I want to do combat with these kinds of people and cross swords with them. So, after 9/11, when all this spate of God-hating books came out from the so-called new atheists, we went straight after them and we said, we challenge you guys to public debates. And so we did 4 with I think it was four with Richard Dawkins, multiple, at least 3, possibly 4 with Hitchens. I debated Hitchens, as did Wilson, and Michael Shermer, the now late Dan Dennett, various others, along with Muslims. And how that took me to globalism is that at the time, Lennox, atheism resided, at least this type of virulent, militant atheism, chiefly, not exclusively, but chiefly resided in the academic world. And since that time, as I like to say, I've been tracking it like a hunter. I've been following it as it's marched through various institutions until it now resides high in the Alps, policymaking at Davos, meeting there on an annual basis. So that's what's driving me, because globalism, as we're speaking of it here, is atheistic to its black-hearted core, as is USAID with its agenda.
Right, right. Yeah, that's so good, so excellent. I'm just curious to know what kind of responses you get from your work. Are you encouraged by the way Christians have responded to it? Do you think that the needle has moved somewhat from Christians not being willing to have those kinds of engagements and debates or thinking in the right categories? Do you think we've made progress over time? How's your work being
It's
received?
a very good question, Lennox. Let me ask you a question.
Certainly.
This is the first time we've met. So anyone who's listening, we didn't have any previous conversations. So I don't come with any actual
Right.
knowledge of you, but your name and the slight accent that I detect makes me think that perhaps either maybe you were born of immigrants in this country, or perhaps you're from, say, Tanzania, or maybe you're from Zambia, possibly. Maybe Uganda, where there's a strong Christian presence. Tell me your origins.
Yeah, so my origins is I'm natively Zambian, lived there for a long time, but grew up in South Africa, which is why my accent might also sound as confused as it does. Yeah, so that's some of my origin.
I
Yeah,
asked that question because I sensed that possibly Zambia was in there somewhere.
right.
A country that has been generally, in fairly safe by African standards, and yet Islam is starting to flow into that country. And you said at the beginning something of your own experience. You hinted at your own experience with the evil of some of the things like USAID and globalism and some of the things that are happening there. So, when did you come to this country? How old were you?
Actually, just about a year ago. I'm still very new to the United States. So, yeah,
How old are you?
I'm 32 years old.
Okay, I don't mean to turn the interview around.
No, of course. I love this. This is good.
But the what I'm getting at here is you didn't come here when you were 2 and you have no memory of that. You have a very vivid memory of that. And you see
Absolutely.
the average American, coming back to your question, Lennox, the average American, 69% of Americans have never been out of the country. And I have European friends who feel pretty smug about that. Oh, we speak so many languages and we go so many places. And I say, look at a map. I can drive from Northeast France and hit Belgium and Holland and Germany and Luxembourg and be back in France in a day. The United States is almost continental sized. The average American, first of all, doesn't get that much by way of vacation, a couple of weeks a year. But take, for example, my father-in-law. He worked in a meat packing plant. The idea that he was going to get his family to Europe was just absurd. He'd have to blow all of his vacation at once for that, and furthermore, it would just not be financially feasible. So what happens? Well, the average American has maybe been on a fishing trip in Canada. Maybe they got drunk in Tijuana, or maybe they had a honeymoon in the Caribbean. Maybe they've been on a mission trip somewhere, or possibly in their collegiate years they went to London, Paris, or Rome. Those are generally the places they've been. The point being, the average American doesn't know what's going on in the world. So when Americans are told, as they have been for decades now, but especially since Obama in 2008, Americans have been told in an unrelenting propaganda campaign that your country is evil, that it's racist, that it is the global villain. We're now hearing Tucker Carlson platform people who are suggesting that the United States was along with Winston Churchill and Britain, were the villains in World War II, and that maybe Hitler wasn't such a bad guy after all. I mean, this is the kind of nonsense we're starting to hear. I feel that it's, Lennox, and this touches on a slightly different topic. I don't do what I do because I'm interested in clicks. I don't do what I do because it's a job and it's better than working construction. it's my calling.
Right.
This is my mission. Not by that, I don't mean necessarily doing interviews or doing podcasts, like ideas have consequences, but engaging the world, defending the faith is my calling. And the way that spills over into issues of truth and trying to help people, whether it's historic truth or biblical truth, all truth belongs to Jesus Christ. I am the way,
Yes.
truth. We all measure from that. So I think a lot of Christians, I will say that when I first started engaging on these issues 20 years ago, I did have friends, well-intentioned friends, who'd say, Larry, who cares what some pointy-headed academic at Oxford University is saying about God? That's not really affecting the real world. And I was trying to say, no, you don't understand. It is, because there are young people who are being affected by this, who are believing this, who are buying Dawkins' bestseller book, The God Delusion, at that particular time. Well, now it's all moved past guys like that. They're almost, Dawkins, I think, very much feels it. I maintain some interaction with him these days, and I can tell that he feels like a movement that he had a part in creating has left him behind, and that he's not deemed radical enough anymore. I mean, we're now moving from, more in the realm of Peter Singer, another guy that we've debated, who is in favor of infanticide. I mean, we're moving towards these kinds of things. So I think that more Christians are waking up. I will say that there are still a lot of Christians who would see what I do as, Larry, come on, is this some kind of conspiracy theory that you're engaging? I mean, these people who are meeting in Davos, come on, are they really doing these things? Yes, they really are. But I think recent years, since COVID, I have sensed a dramatic change in how Christians are now starting to perceive what's going on in the world, and perhaps their need to engage it in more than just showing up and voting every 4 years.
That's good. Do you think that lack of engagement beforehand boils down to significant biblical, philosophical illiteracy? Is that what it boils down to? And if so, how do we get from a Christianity that has had the most robust influence in the world over time to a Christianity that's truncated to only a few things in life, a Christianity that is somewhat impotent to address real prevalent issues in the world? Just what's your theory of how we got there in the first place?
Well, it's not a verse in the Bible. It's a line in Thucydides' History of the Peloponnesian War, where he quotes Pericles in the famous funeral oration, which Lincoln would use as a model for the Gettysburg Address. But Pericles, the Athenian statesman, after a year of war, and he's the Athenian population is depressed, and they're burying their honored dead, and he uses it to elevate it to something else. And he says this, he says, happiness depends on freedom, and freedom depends on courage. Mm-hmm. Now, that was 431 BC, but the truth of that still resonates and it still applies. And I think that what we're missing these days is a masculine, confident courage. We have witnessed an incredible decline of courage within the church. And, I sometimes joke, this is perhaps jarring to you, Lennox, but, my father was career Army. He was an airborne ranger, fought in multiple, meaning, as some would say, if you're not familiar with what that is, special forces. I was born on a military base. I grew up on military bases. I grew up around men who killed people for a living. When it comes down to that, and I sometimes joke, my father killed Marxists for a living. I guess I can tweet against them. Surely I can speak out against, that kind of evil, the kinds of things that we're seeing. And I think what happened is that there was a feminization of the church. Multiple books have been written about this, why men hate church, as as one of them, along with multiple others. Feminization of the church and a cowardly kind of preaching that wanted to stay away from anything controversial. And that didn't necessarily mean the perverse sexual agenda of the left. It might have just meant not preaching on divorce.
Right.
Maybe I don't want to make people mad. There are probably some divorced people, here, maybe not speaking out against things, that are just some of the more Christian basics. So I think that what happened before, without even talking about churches that are quote unquote woke, let's just say churches that might even be deemed to be good churches where they're more or less preaching the word, but where they're avoiding the hard parts of that.
Right.
So that I think a lot of Christians going to, again, quote unquote, good churches, Bible believing churches, where a guy comes out of a service and he goes, well, that sermon on John chapter 2 was very interesting. I mean, Jesus could turn water into wine. Wow. I don't know what that has to do with what's going on out here. And so I think there's been a catastrophic failure in helping Christians see the relevance of their faith with the world.
Yes.
We've not been good at giving a world view to people, the tools they need to understand that world and to engage it. And so we become very cloistered, very inwardly focused, where a lot of people, I think a lot of Christians think only in terms of, well, my salvation, I'm going to heaven. And in the meantime, I just kind of wait here. And things are getting bad, but there you have it. And I think the Lord would have us know, he would have us have dominion over it, to engage the world and to engage it confidently and courageously. And that hasn't been happening. Now, I am seeing more of it since COVID, but we need a lot more.
Yes, we absolutely do. I think I like to think of this as, one of those consequences of secularism, and the idea of pietism, I think, is secularism's twin sister in many ways. Whereas in secularism, you have this attempt to push God out of the public square and into the fringes, or just completely obliterate the idea of God at all. Pietism kind of gives a hearty amen to that and says, yes, you're right, God isn't interested in all that anyway. And so we'll just focus on the things that we believe he cares about: personal devotion, showing up to church on a Sunday, and those kinds of things. And I think because of that, we have effectively surrendered our intellectual potency and influence in the public square, because we have conceded to the lie that Christianity and Christ has no bearing on the rest of the world. And I think that certainly has been catastrophic. And I think off of that, I firmly believe that as Christians, it's our impotence in that has actually perhaps facilitated the chaos that we see around us. We're responsible for discipling the nations into the chaos that we see today.
I think you're dead on.
Yeah. To kind of just get some definitions going here, people might have heard the term globalism before, but you want to just break down for us, like, what does it mean? What is globalism, and why do you believe it to be dangerous?
Well, globalism, we can mean several things by that. Two most prominently will be, say, we're in a global economy, and there is globalism in the sense that the United States is involved with trade with China and India and the European Union, and there's economic globalism. Okay. Then there's the kind of globalism that's being pushed by the left, and by organizations like the World Economic Forum, where it's about the annihilation of borders, and it's about the loss of sovereignty for nations, and where unelected bureaucrats. It's already happened with the EU. I mean, you have Ursula von der Leyen, who is the unelected president of the European Commission. She was just meeting with Trump like she's a head of state. And the EU has sought increasingly from its beginning to annihilate European borders and to give the EU sovereign authority over each of its members. This kind of thing was addressed in the Federalist Papers, more than a couple of hundred years ago, where we're talking about the dangers of an extremely strong, centralized, federal government, and that's and in their case, it's it's an international kind of body. But there's been efforts increasingly from Obama on. It was happening before, but in a much bigger way in the last 20 years, to annihilate our borders, to force upon the American people an agenda that they do not want, and to surrender authority to organizations like the World Health Organization,
Right.
the UN, and various other bodies. Power over the American people. That's what they want. That's a goal. I think that's extremely dangerous. I like, somebody who I admire hugely. I've never actually met her personally, though I came very close when I was in Italy a couple of years ago, is Giorgia Meloni, the prime minister of Italy. And I will not quote her exactly correctly, but she won me over when she was running for office. And she said, I am a woman, I am a mother, I am a Christian, and I'm an Italian. I admire people who love their own countries. I was recently, as I think I had a very close call in Cairo,
Yes.
outside of USAID, and I'm sitting there with my my Egyptian driver, who was a friend, and he had asked me if I love America, and I said I do. I said I love my country. I said I don't love everything my country has done. My country has been Jekyll and Hyde in its influence around the world, depending on the administration, and I hate the blight of abortion. I hate our nefarious involvement in various global conflicts right now, Ukraine. I said, but yes, I do love my country. And he thought for a moment. There was silence. Then he said, I love my country too. And I said, and you should. You should. I said, I admire that. Doesn't mean you agree with everything that happens here, but you love its people. You love its history. You love its culture. I think the efforts to annihilate cultural distinctions. Now, when we're talking about cultures with practices that are damnable, the practice of sati, throwing a widow on her husband's funeral pyre. That's the British ended that when they came to India, and they did so rightly. Or child rape and marriages and things of this nature. On the other hand, I think it's terrible that organizations, globalists, who are so smug. These are people who love to think that they're not racist. They are the most racist people.
Yes.
They like to think that they appreciate diversity. They hate diversity. Look what happened when all of the brown-skinned people showed up in Martha's Vineyard, and what did they do? They called out the National Guard. They didn't want people there who didn't look like them, who weren't in their economic bracket. They didn't want them there. They want to speak platitudes to all that. These people are racist. They're hateful, but worse, they're arrogant, and they think they have the right to say how everybody in the world should be living. And that's why I call the World Economic Forum the HOA from hell, the Homeowners Association from hell. It's the way they think. And so I see loads of dangers in this, but chiefly as a Christian, I know that what's driving it is secular utopian ideology that's utterly absent. These people are no longer debating God's existence. They've just come to the conclusion there isn't one. And now they're seeking to impose that ideology on everyone else. By the way, did I, at the beginning of this conversation, I did say Zambia, right? Or did I?
You did. You did actually say Zambia.
I didn't say Namibia, did I?
Yeah, no, you didn't say Namibia, and I found it fascinating that you were just dead on there. So yeah, Zambia is my origin in that sense. Yeah, I love the picture that you've painted here. When I think of what globalism is and what it's become, I don't know how else to describe it other than an effort towards international egalitarianism. And I find it interesting that you point to how there's an intentional effort to erase distinction, specifically cultural distinction. And what I've been thinking about very recently is how distinction is often the substance of what makes something aesthetically pleasant, or that's exactly what beauty is. There is a beauty in distinction. And once you tarnish or distort beauty, you begin to distort even things like patriotism, for example, or military strength. And I think that there's a real intentional effort to do that through the pushing of, androgyny. That's kind of what you see with the whole LGBTQ movement. And this attempt to distort that which God has called good and that he has called beautiful. And that's what makes this so messy and so destructive. And we need to respond to this with a sense of strength and courage, as you have rightly noted. And speaking to that, Larry, what does this look like to really confront this head on and actually deal with this? Do we need to replicate more Larry Tauntons who are going to go on the front line of the battle and create awareness? But what can more people do? What can Christians do to really confront the evil of all of this?
Well, I think that we begin engaging at the local level. But one of the things that I often point Christians to, who will say to me, gosh, I don't think I could debate, a Muslim on Al Jazeera or Christopher Hitchens, or that's not the point. There are people that you will meet, that those who are listening to us will meet, that will never have an opportunity to engage. I think of 1 Peter 3:15, always be ready to give answer. That is a defense for the hope that is in you. And I like the way Peter puts it there, because, and of course, as you know, the word that's translated there as answer, or sometimes translated as a defense, is a Greek word apologia. It's where we get the word apologetics. But Peter doesn't there say defend the hope that's in somebody else. Defend it in you. And I always tell people, look, no one, not your namesake, John Lennox, not Doug Wilson, not Larry Taunton, not, Charles Spurgeon, has the ability to defend the totality of belief. There's a reason why the initial debates that we did with Dawkins, I went and got John Lennox, who was absolutely an unknown. But I knew that I'd heard John, I had become friends with John, who was not known in the United States at all. And I knew that John had the academic background. He's a scientist, mathematician, in addition to being a theologian. And I thought, this is going to be a debate on science. I'm not qualified, to do that. Dawkins will take me into the tall grass, and I'm not prepared to go there. Now, I've crossed swords with him many times on, issues of history or philosophy, but I'm not going there on science. You can do as much damage as you can good for the faith, weighing in on things where you scarcely have any understanding. So defend the hope that is in you. And that begins by just telling your story. How does Jesus Christ changed your life? What does that look like? And don't be prepared. Before I took my oral examinations, a Pulitzer Prize nominee pulled me into his office, and he said, look, these guys aren't going to ask you questions they don't know the answers to. If you don't know, say, I don't know. And I've never forgotten that bit of advice, because it's okay to say, that's a good question. I don't know. And I know people who do, or give me some time and I'll go do a little research on that issue. But I think people have to engage in where the Lord has planted them, raising up godly children, helping them to understand, to navigate, to articulate and defend their faith. Doing it in our churches, doing it in our communities, getting involved at the local level where a lot of this evil is really being pushed. I think it begins at those kind of places. And if the Lord leads you to engage with a podcast or some kind of big platform, then great. But it doesn't need to translate into that. We need people engaging, fulfilling the Great Commission at the grassroots level.
Yeah, I think that's so well said. The sense in which the solution is it's not rocket science. It's not complicated. It's just doing the kinds of things that Christ has already called us to do, and I think that's quite profound. Larry, I've kind of heard you differentiate between how globalism is intent on pushing fascism, in contrast to something like Marxism. You just help me to discern the difference between these two ideologies. What's the difference between fascism and Marxism, and why is it important to clarify those specific distinctions?
Yeah, this is kind of a nuanced issue, and I've done a couple of podcasts on this just to try to help people understand it, because these terms are thrown around so casually. You're a Nazi if you disagree with me, or you're a fascist, you're a communist. So that meaning is lost. And that's part of what the left wants, is they want to dilute actual meaning. What is a woman? So it's a philosophical question and not a biological, question. And another reason I feel it's important to address this is because increasingly I am seeing people on the so-called right, we're stuck with this paradigm, that I don't like, which is right and left. So we just kind of have to, we kind of have to use those terms. I've used it multiple times just in this interview, but it can get very, very confusing for people. So I've tried to bring some clarity to that. The easiest way to think about that, using that paradigm of left and right, most of us were taught either because there was an agenda just to get us to buy this, or maybe we were taught it by teachers who themselves have been taught it and were just kind of unwitting accomplices. But that this idea that communism is an expression of the extreme left, and that fascism, Nazism, is an expression of the extreme right. So that would give you the impression that at the center is freedom, and the further you move out on either side, the closer you get to tyranny on either side. No, fascism and Nazism are over here. They're on the left as well, and that's because there's very little distinction from the point of view of the governed between fascism and communism, Bolshevism, socialist, Marxism. And it's because they're both totalitarian, they're both godless, they're both fundamentally anti-human, they're all about the collective, they're both historicists, to use a term by Karl Popper, the philosopher, meaning they're ideas that claim to have a predictive power, about the future, that history is moving irresistibly in a particular direction. And there are distinctions between them, is that one of them sees the world in terms of history, in terms of a race war, fascism, and Marxism sees it as an economic war, but both of them deterministic in that regard. I would say the further you move to the right, you're not moving towards tyranny, you're moving towards anarchy. So it's less state controls. So freedom on the right, which can be, complete anarchy where there's no controls or structures whatsoever. And then the further you go to the left, the more state controls, the less individual, liberties. That's where we find ourselves now. It's important to understand that while all Nazis are fascists, not all fascists are Nazis. The distinction being that Nazism is a subset of fascism, and its distinction is chiefly found in the fact that it's virulently anti-Semitic. But fascism has always had a strain of anti-Semitism in it, and fascism is by definition racist. So when you have a guy like Daryl Cooper, this pseudo historian that Tucker Carlson has platformed no less than twice, who self-describes as a non-racist fascist, it tells me right away he's an idiot, because it's clear he doesn't understand even what fascism is. Fascism is by definition racist, because it sees history in terms of a race war. And it's because it's deeply influenced by Darwinian thought. And do tell me if I'm becoming a little too academic.
Oh, I love it. Let's go down this rabbit hole. Keep going. I love it.
But it has a strong, it's strongly influenced by Darwinian evolution. So Darwin's Origin of Species, published in 1859, some of the terminology that began entering into the culture were, terms like survival of the fittest. And fascists believe in survival of the fittest. They love that. And Darwin's influence, we could make another line that shows, and again, we could just keep going back into history, but we got to start somewhere. Darwin's influence on Nietzsche and on Wagner, and their influence in turn on Adolf Hitler and on Karl Marx. Karl Marx wanted to dedicate the first volume of Das Kapital, Capital, to Darwin, and Darwin wisely declined the dubious honor. But Marx immediately saw in Darwin, see, now we have three historicist schemes. One of them is biological. History, there's a predictive quality to history according to Darwin based on biology. Marx, it's based on economics. And fascism, it's based on kind of that biological element again. It's based on race. It's based on race. So all of these came out of, the post-59 period, 1859, period. I know that, the Communist Manifesto was published in 1844. 1848 rather.
1848, yeah.
1848, and the Conditions of the Working Class in England in 1844 was published, 1844. So that's a Marx and Engels, work. But the point being, they're deeply influenced by Darwinian, meaning absolutely godless ideology that thinks in terms of survival of the fittest. And that's where we ended up with terms like social Darwinism. So social Darwinism, you start getting into eugenics. You have Margaret Sanger, who comes along and pushing eugenics and pushing, the founder of Planned Parenthood, all these kinds of things. And where the Nazis began, measuring heads and noses and saying, this is a subspecies here. All Slavs, all Jews, all gypsies, they all just need to be exterminated because they're a less evolved element of the human species. That's the way they would think. And you see fascists would buy into that kind of stuff. And in the post-World War II period, I was just in Berlin, and in the post-World War II period, it fascinates me how the communists brilliantly, they marketed communism, socialism, Marxism as the ideological opposite of fascism. And in the post-World War II period, if you're a German, you don't want anyone to think you were ever Sieg Heiling or that you ever wore the swastika badge. So what do you say? I'm a communist. I'm a communist, which was tantamount to saying I'm the enemy of Nazism. I'm the enemy of fascism. I sit on the ideological opposite. Well, guess what? It isn't the ideological opposite. There's very little difference between the two of them, and they both arrive at the same place. And again, that's why I say, from the perspective of the governed, and if you ever interview people who've lived under both, which is chiefly Eastern Europe, where first the Operation Barbarossa, June 22nd, 1941, 175 divisions, 4.5 million German troops cross the German frontier into Russia and invade, and they occupy the whole of Eastern Europe. Those people, those populations lived under the Nazis. And then after Stalingrad, January, February of 43, when the Russians break the Wehrmacht at Stalingrad, and then the Red Army starts flowing, westward, and they start reconquering, these territories and occupying them. Those populations, another hero of mine, a guy like Richard Wurmbrand. I don't know if you're familiar with him, but your audience should be. You're young. But when I was a child, I remember my mother having the book Tortured for Christ, on her bookshelf, and it was Richard Wurmbrand's story, first of suffering under the Nazis, then under the communists, both of whom hated him. Why? Because he was a Lutheran pastor. He was a Christian, and he was virulently, as every Christian must be, anti-fascist, anti-Nazi, anti-socialist, anti-Marxist, anti-communist, anti-Bolshevik. And he said, no, I will stand against these things and I will preach against them. And the man, suffered horribly. I was in Romania, I think it was last year, maybe it was year before, I went to Pitești prison, which is where Christians were tortured in ways that beggar the imagination. You think, why don't they just shoot them? Why don't they just kill them? But they went to great lengths to make sure they couldn't commit suicide so that they could torture them for years. It's astonishing satanic evil. And both of those ideologies, socialism, Marxism, I'm categorizing those as one thing.
Yes.
And fascism, they're both satanic, utterly satanic. And so people need to understand when they hear that someone is, I was just reading an article that said that the Japanese people who, the Japanese prime minister just resigned under pressure, public pressure, because he's been following a kind of open borders policy in Japan. And so the people, the Japanese people, there's been a pushback on that. And the Telegraph called them hard right wing. And I thought, so they're hard right wing because they want to protect their culture. I mean, really? Because they don't want to see happen to their country what they know has happened to Europe.
Exactly.
And so they're referred to as right wing. And you're also seeing a term that's being pushed in a big way, woke right. I make war on that. It's an oxymoron. It makes no sense. And I have people who say to me, well, Larry, there are people on the right who are using leftist tactics. And I say, well, then you're on the left. Your tactics define your organization. They define who you are. And this idea that somehow we'll riot and murder people only until we get power and then we'll stop doing that, it never works out that way. If you're using leftist tactics, it's because you're a leftist. So there's no such thing as woke right. If you're woke, you're on the left.
Yeah, I think that's very, very well described. Everything that you're saying here, all these ideologies that you put into question here, socialism, Marxism, fascism, leftism, what makes me so upset, to kind of break down each one, is when I think of the third world, where I've spent a considerable time of my life, I think of much of the third world as laboratories of leftist propaganda. That's what it is.
That's a great way of putting it. I like that.
There's a very intentional effort to sow socialism and Marxism as the main dogma and social currency of the day, and this has been going on for a very long time, for many decades. I can think of African countries, for example, that in the aftermath of colonialism having come to an end, adopted post-colonialism, which is fundamentally anti-Western, and which is fundamentally pro-communist. And you see the establishment of communist regimes in the immediate aftermath of colonialism having come to an end. Interesting thing that comes with that as well, immediately several colonial entities leave Africa. You see this significant surge of Islam coming into Africa as well, very aggressive. And when I think of the entities that have enabled this, I mean, there's a variety. We've already kind of pointed out how, sure, the church and to a great degree is complicit in this. They allowed this to happen. But when you look at much of the third world, you discover that entities such as the United Nations, the World Economic Forum, are really engineering a lot of the policy behind a lot of this, that enables all these ideologies to permeate. And then you bring in an entity like USAID, which basically, I think, funds a lot of this as well. It funds that anti-Western sentiment. It funds essentially communism. I've been fascinated to kind of see the aftermath of USAID being pulled in the way the Trump administration has sought to pull it. And all of a sudden, these institutions that invested a lot into pushing this sort of destructive propaganda, they're now reeling. They're suffocating, and I love to see it. I want to see more of that. But Larry, I think there's what people don't often realize is the truth behind a lot of the euphemisms, and that's often what's used here. Like, it's the use of euphemisms. You think of the United Nations and their efforts to promote the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals, and I'd like for you to just kind of break down what we should understand by that. When they use terms like sustainability, what should we understand by that? When they use, for example, ESG is another big thing that I think we should break down as well. These words that seem somewhat disarming to those who might not have their faculties of discernment well established. How should we think about these words? And why are they so intentional about using this specific verbiage to push their propaganda?
Very good comments and a good question. I tell my audience, the listeners to Ideas Have Consequences, I say, listen for the word sustainability. That's the word you want to, there are others, but that's one you want to be listening for, because that is, that word is freighted with anti-human meaning. And the example that I use is that at Nuremberg, the Nuremberg trials post-World War II, where the Nazi war criminals are being tried, I've read the depositions, which are fascinating. You know, they're taking place privately, you know, before they're ever in the front of the public. That is, the depositions that were done by the Western, you know, lawyers and interrogators. And they're fascinating because they're sitting down, say, with Rudolf Hess, the camp commandant, not the one who flew to Scotland, but the one who was the camp commandant at Auschwitz, and others, a guy by the name of Pohl, Pohl, who was one of the guys who sort of ran the ovens and so forth there. And they're talking to these guys, and the term final solution, you know, comes up. And we now know what that means. It's a reference to the Holocaust, but at the time that verbiage wasn't known in the West. And finally, the interrogators say, "You keep using that. What are you talking about?" And then they are like, "Oh my gosh, you're talking about the extermination of the Jews, of the Slavs, of Gypsies, of others. That's what you're talking about. You're using a euphemism to hide from us and from yourself the actual meaning, you know, of what you're doing." Well, the new final solution is sustainability. Sustainability is the new word, new buzzword that has an anti-human meaning. And so when they talk about economic sustainability, agricultural sustainability, population sustainability, they don't care about you. They don't care about me. It all sounds very good, and it's spoken in such calm and warm tones. And it's absolutely evil, you know, what is coming behind that. So that each year I go to the World Economic Forum, I pretend to be one of them. You know, Eric Metaxas jokes that I'm a spy, and that I go, and I don't go with press credentials. I go and just sit and listen. And it's fascinating what people will say when they think they're just sitting among other people who share their worldview. And they'll talk about depopulation, the need for depopulation, as though they're talking about batting averages. You know,
Wow.
It's so calm and it's so collected and it's so absolutely elitist. That's going on there. They're also individuals, and listen, this is part of my work. What I feel like I kind of specialize in is I'm working upriver where the policies, the ideas are formed, and then I go downstream to see how they're actually playing out on the ground, what they actually look like on the ground. So that I'm sitting at the World Economic Forum and I'm listening to former British Prime Minister Theresa May talking about all that they're doing for Ukrainian refugees who are coming into Poland and allegedly being trafficked. And I went up to her afterwards, and it's actually very funny. We have photographs. It's like a progression. She has this huge smile when she first greets me, and then it goes, progressively into a look of she's trying to escape me. But I said, Miss May, have you ever been there? No. I said, well, I've been in Ukraine many times. And I said, in fact, it just so happens I was just in Poland talking with Ukrainian refugees who are pouring out of Ukraine, and they're saying, you guys are doing nothing. You guys just said you're doing all these things for them. It's Christian organizations that are helping these people. I was there with them. I was talking with them. And you spoke of Ukraine in these terms of, she had the Ukrainian lapel pin on, and they all did, and they're all pushing this idea that Zelensky and Ukraine are, really the bastions of democracy. I said it's arguably it's one of the most corrupt countries in the world. I had to bribe every single government official I dealt with there, with the exception of one, to adopt my daughter from that country. I said Transparency International ranks it as one of the most corrupt countries in the world, just like Russia. And she's backpedaling. But the point I was trying to make here is you people, you gather and you have all these wine and cheese events, and none of you have bothered to go downstream to see what's going on. And to speak to something that you would have a firsthand knowledge of, it reminds me of one of my dear friends is an Anglican bishop in Nigeria, arguably the most dangerous country in the world, as you would well know. Nobody even talks about it because it's not that things like that don't happen in evil that would happen there don't happen in other parts of Africa. It's just a sheer scale of the terror in Nigeria. And so I go to Nigeria. I have to be hidden because I didn't see another white human being in central and northern Nigeria. And Juan, as I call him, the bishop, said, look, me, they'll kill. You, they'll want to kidnap you and start sending, body parts to your family members and demanding millions of dollars. You have to be hidden. So they would lay me down in a car so I wouldn't be visible. They would smuggle me into places, and I was preaching at the cathedral there. And at some point I said, Juan, I'm going to have to be seen some, and there will have to be some. We'll take reasonable precautions, but we'll also have to trust, the Lord in this. And as I'm going to preach at the cathedral, this cathedral in Jos, Nigeria, Plateau State, it used to be a fully Christian community. Now the cathedral is like an island surrounded by Muslims. And as I'm going to the cathedral, they're crowding around me, and add to this the fact that, I'm 6'3", shock of gray hair. As Juan likes to say, he says, you're like an American cowboy. And they're pushing up against me, some of it, which just has to do with the fact they're just curious. They're fascinated. But there's also a bullying element. And there's an effort to threaten my personal space. And I make it pretty clear. I shove a few people I make it pretty clear you will respect my space. You will not get up close to me. I need to be careful. I'm not knifed. They begin to back away. I make my way to the cathedral. They're all sitting on the wall surrounding the cathedral that had been bombed by Boko Haram. And now you have the Fulani herdsmen militia who are murdering members of this diocese, taking girls off into sex slavery, murdering the women. I mean, things that are happening in a very big way. And guess who's aiding it? Not a shock to you, the United Nations, because when the Christians there began arming themselves to defend themselves, the UN called it a human rights violation and came and took away all of their means of doing so. The point that I'm trying to make here is there's that you have, on the one hand, you have the policymakers who aren't on the ground to see any of this. They are not going to risk themselves.
Yeah.
I was writing a series for Fox News called The Forgotten Christians of Nigeria, which you can find online. But the second group is that I come back and I find myself speaking at another kind of, I'll say, wine and cheese kind of Christian event. By the way, I have nothing against wine and cheese. I'm rather trying to characterize what I call champagne ministry, where it's this kind of smug, elitist, absolutely divorced Trinity Forum. It's just completely divorced from the real world. And I'm telling this story, and I have the bishop with me. We're talking about Christian persecution in Africa. And this smug character at the back of the room raises his hand and he says, Larry, you know, this all just feels to me like an exaggeration. I mean, Muslims just want to live like the rest of us, and they just want to be. I felt rage. I wanted to punch that man in the face, and I did, because he just casually dismissed the suffering of people. I've seen it firsthand. It's tantamount to Holocaust denial. It's like, not really happening. And I love what Juan said. Juan is slight of build, but he has a James Earl Jones baritone. And this guy had said, they just want to be our friends. And Juan said, has anyone ever tried to rape your wife? And he said, no. He said, have they put your sons to the machete or taken your daughters off into sex slavery? He said, no. Has someone pushed their cattle across your crops, deliberately destroying your means of just feeding yourself and your family? Have they burned your home, murdered your friends, cut the breasts off of nursing mothers, the lips off of men and women? Have you seen this? Have you suffered this? And he said, no. And he said, these are not people who want to be your friends.
Exactly.
But you see, the average American is so isolated from these kind of things, they can't quite conceive of it. And we need those kind of voices. There was a time, I remember a book I read some years ago, World War II. It was called With the Old Breed. It's a memoir of a guy who fought in the Pacific. And he begins the book by saying that he got drunk with a bunch of friends in my home city of Birmingham, Alabama. He said, we drove over to Atlanta and we joined the Marine Corps. And he said, we had no idea. We were so naive. We had no idea what we were doing. And he said, and we're going through the line and they're handing us things. And we get to this battle-hardened veteran who's come back from the Pacific. And he hands us dog tags, the chain necklace with your blood type, with your name, unit number, these kinds of things on it. And he said, and I said, what are these for? And he said, we're joking around and laughing like it's all fun and games. And he says, well, son, that's so we can identify your body when you're blown up on some godforsaken rock in the Pacific. And he said, I knew in that moment, oh my, this isn't fun and games anymore. This is real. Yeah. We need those people, those voices, yours perhaps, Juan's, others, who are coming from the Okinawas, who are coming from the Iwo Jimas, from the Tarawas, from the Saipans, who are informing the American people, this is what's coming.
Exactly. Right.
If you do not wake up, this is what communism looks like. This is what fascism looks like. This is what a Muslim invasion looks like. And Americans are incredibly naive about this. Europeans are waking up to it, I fear, far too late.
Yes. Yes. Yeah, you're absolutely right, Larry. One of the big reasons that I moved out to where I am to work with New St. Andrews College is because I think of it as an institution that does a very good job of instilling in students these fundamental theological categories for how to view the world, but also how to discern ideology and understand what's coming. And more than that, trying to prepare people to lead against it and to build in spite of it. And that's one of the things that prompted me to come across the ocean, to kind of join hands with an entity that saw what I was seeing, that sees what I see, and wants to inoculate America against a lot of the rot that's already beginning to happen, and have people be able to build institutions, good, strong, solid Christian institutions that can resist that rot. And of course, Moscow, in that sense, is a unique project in how it's resisted a lot of that. But I deeply resonate with everything that you've said here. It's not cute. Marxism isn't just some cute talking point from Bernie Sanders. Same with socialism. Same with a lot of things that we hear being pushed in American media today. These are ideas that actually destroy civilizations. And if we don't recover a rich and robust biblical Christianity, I think we will not have the tools to be able to discern what's going on and to actually do something about it. So I really appreciate you saying everything there. I know that your time is pressed here, and I don't want to.
We've got 10 more minutes if you want.
Okay, sure. One of the things that I wanted to press into here a little bit is just foreign aid. We kind of mentioned USAID. You had a very interesting encounter in Egypt, which, and if you want to get into that, you can. But I remember earlier this year, around the time that you and I started to connect directly, I had tweeted out basically why foreign aid is a bad idea. And I'll just list here very quickly what I said. I listed 10 things. I said, firstly, that it's dehumanizing. Second, that it disincentivizes enterprise and innovation. Thirdly, it encourages irresponsibility, overdependency, and entitlement. Fourth, it enables political corruption. Fifth, it dishonestly funds the lavish lifestyles of international NGO workers, which is something people don't always realize, is how international NGOs push a lot of this dogma. They're living the high life in the third world, and it's all funded by American tax dollars. Sixth, it advances socialist and Marxist dogma. Seventh, it's a vehicle of leftist propaganda. Eighth, it facilitates globalism. Ninth, it funds infanticide. 10, it deepens poverty with a veneer of development. I could probably have made this list a lot longer and mentioned how it basically manipulates Westerners into giving money that should rightfully belong to them. It's a vehicle for pushing the exact thing that's going to destroy civilizations. Now, I know you've had a keen interest in addressing these kinds of things. You've had an interest in exposing what's wrong with USAID. And so do you want to just kind of unpack your own thoughts on what you make of USAID and it getting defunded effectively by the Department of State and the Trump administration?
Well, first, let me say that I agree with everything you just said. I agree with all of that, and I would give it I'd put some theological rebar in it by saying this, that there are those who, again, they prey on people who are what I call Christian-ish. They've been deeply influenced by a Christian ethic without actually having the theological foundation, the biblical foundation to give guardrails to ideas of love, or tolerance or diversity. These are biblical ideas that have been hijacked by the left, and people who are Christian-ish in the West are easily manipulated with them when they say, take an issue like homosexuality. Well, shouldn't they be allowed to love each other? Well, again, if you don't have the biblical foundation, then the love becomes this sort of ill-defined, reckless, kind of thing. Well, giving is one of those things. The left has long identified that they can manipulate an American population with the idea that Jesus was, quote unquote, an early socialist. That this is really what he was. And they'll go to things like Acts chapter 5, and they'll say, look, Ananias and Sapphira, they were killed because they didn't give. Like, no, that's not why they were killed. They were killed because they lied to the Holy Spirit. And in fact, in that passage, Peter makes it very clear that the Bible affirms private property. Before you sold the land, was it not yours to do with as you will? And when you sold the land, were the funds not yours to do with as you will? Man, I mean, thou shalt not steal annihilates any notions of socialism, because it affirms that private property is a biblical thing. Now, yes, how that relates to that is this: nowhere does Scripture amputate giving from the gospel. The two go together. So many churches, with the Great Society, 1964, LBJ, the Johnson administration, coming along with things like welfare, that was devastating not only to Black communities, it was devastating to the church, because it took away from the church a responsibility that had generally rested with churches, that they provided help to those who needed it, but also provided oversight, some kind of responsibility, some kind of accountability to people. It then just became a check that you pick up, and the gospel has nothing to do with it. Zero to do with it. So this applies to things like USAID, and it applies to your tweet about giving in general. I think you would agree with me in saying you're not against giving. You're in favor of that being coupled with the gospel. So rather than USAID, a $50 billion a year a rogue agency that was using monies. The American people thought of it as, if they knew of it at all, they just thought, oh, it's kind of the governmental equivalent of Samaritan's Purse. They help, feed people and this kind of stuff. Not realizing until quite recently that USAID was, as I said, a rogue agency and an extremely dangerous and evil organization that provided a window front. Listen, USAID has always hired the young idealist Peace Corps type.
Yes.
Who wanted to have an impact on the world, and who was motivated by good intentions. And listen, they'll give a window front to, I'm sure you've seen it in Africa firsthand, of people who are handing out grain and canned goods and vaccinations and, medical examination. But that's just a veneer to hide the real agenda, which is it's been a front for intelligence agencies, communities. The reason that USAID Cairo responded with absolute terror when I showed up, and that there was an effort to do me in Cairo, was for fear that I knew something about what they were doing. And it almost certainly is because they're being run by Hamas,
right,
and using U.S. money. So no, I agree wholeheartedly with that. I'm a huge believer in Christian communities engaging in problems in their own communities, and also in mission. We were just talking about, all this talk of, Theresa May spouting. I think sincerely, I think she believed it, that they, meaning the EU and Britain and other member organizations of the UN, were doing all these wonderful things for these Ukrainian refugees. I saw zero evidence of that. What I instead saw were Christian churches and agencies doing their best to feed them, providing a measure of accountability, trying to clothe them, and also coupling that with the gospel, so that people understood we're not giving this to you just simply just to be nice. We're doing this because we're believers in a God who commands us to help those that need the help, and to do it because he's commanded us to do that. And we don't want to articulate that, to you. So no, I'm very much a believer in what you said there. And the United States has been using, particularly again, Democrats have been using aid for very nefarious purposes around the world for a long time. We'll give you the aid provided that you loosen abortion restrictions, provided that you loosen restrictions on transgenderism and all these kinds of things. So that's what I mean by the U.S. influence has been Jekyll and Hyde. It has been, there's shining examples of the good Dr. Jekyll's influence through American power around the world, and then the evil Mr. Hyde.
I think that's so well put. Larry, I could speak to you all day. So I just want to say how much I appreciate you availing your time and your wisdom to this conversation. It's an all-important conversation. I hope that you and I can do this again at some point. But
I'd be delighted.
Thank you so much for joining me on A Flames and Crowns today. As we end, we got to end with that toast. So, Larry, what would you like to toast to today?
Well, I toast to you and your podcast. And tell me what you do there.
Yeah, so
you do a podcast, but what other role do you fulfill there?
Yeah, basically it's a general communications role. So digital engagement is my forte. So content creation and a lot of writing, which involves incorporating theology and apologetics in a lot of what I do. So yeah, that's the scope of my work.
Are you married?
Married and three little children.
Oh, congratulations! Yeah. Did she come with you here, or did you meet her in the United States?
No, we all moved up from Zambia just over a year ago. So we're all here and we all made the move together.
Well, congratulations. May the Lord bless you and your family and this endeavor that you've engaged on. And thank you so much for having me.
Oh, thank you so much, Larry. Cheers to you.